Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars, and today we're going to talk about amp maintenance.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, it's cool because kind of during these last several months of COVID and everything else, Chris turned me on to a podcast and then a YouTube channel that kind of really got me going, thinking about my amps more than I do normally in terms of maintenance or just, operationally, which again, historically, and Chris knows this, I'm lazy in terms of guitar maintenance or amp maintenance. It's like, unless something goes wrong, I just kind of forget about it. But what's been cool is going down the rabbit hole of the podcast and then the show, the YouTube show, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But those really got me going in terms of thinking about my amps and the tubes and are they happy, and also recently my Vox was kind of acting up, and so sure enough it was a tube and I replaced it, and now I've got spare tubes, and so I'm trying to be a good amp citizen. How about you, Chris?
Same. I mean, I went through a long period of time where I got really busy. So I just kind of just let my amps kind of just be amps and didn't really think anything about them. Just grab one when I need one, play, record, do all this stuff. And I think it was the shot across the bow for me was like the tube shortage. And I'm like, wait a minute, I better take stock in what I have here and what I need and how to, take care of this shit so I can get the most life out of my tubes and my amps. So that's what I did. I started going through all my amp, doing just like general service, but also doing super nerdy things. Like I popped them open, did like shots of the insides and took voltage readings.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just think it's, something you tend not to think about when stuff is working. It's like, great, I don't have to think about it. But, I have a few vintage amps. I kind of feel like I'm the steward of this thing, right?
Yeah.
I kind of got to keep it, running for, who knows how long I'll be here. Someone's going to have this after me. And, keep it as original as possible too. You know what I mean? I just don't want to go in there and start replacing things.
Yeah.
So in order to not do that, I got really into learning about how shit works in there. Like in the past, I mentioned before that I used to build tube amps back in 2008-ish or something. And then I just kind of let those skills go. And over the pandemic and the tube shortage, I got kind of back into it again. And it's been pretty exciting. And that's what led me to the podcast that I found. And there's several YouTube channels that I kind of check out just for info and just inspiration.
Well, talking about you building amps, what got you into that? I'm kind of curious about that, because I remember you telling me and showing me amps that you built, and they were really cool. I played through a couple. What got you into that when you were doing that? Was it just that you wanted a certain amp but you couldn't afford it, or just sheer curiosity?
No, absolutely. That's it. I always wanted a tweed amp and I couldn't afford it. But the thing that really got me into it, probably in like 2006 or something, there was like a blowout on Epiphone Val Jr. amps. It was like $100 single tube amp. It was based on like a Champ. Oh. I snagged one of those, like kind of impulse bought one of those. And through that, there were all of these like budding modification sites for modifying that amp. So I just took that amp apart, modified it a million times, and it kind of got me inside of amps and figuring out amp safety and all that stuff. And I just started trying a bunch of shit, and I really liked dicking around with that. So my very next step was to try to build a tweed amp. And around that time, I was in a thrift store and I found an old Silvertone air organ. Like it was a stand-up, like just a cheap Italian-made organ section with a little tube amp in the bottom. And the tube amp in the bottom was basically a Champ. It was from like 1961. It was kind of a hot mess, but I used that. I used the tubes, the transformers, and anything else I could salvage. And I built a 5F1 tweed Champ. So I went out and I bought like a repro Champ chassis, mounted the transformers, mounted like tube sockets and anything else that I could salvage. And then I built the circuit board. So I learned how to build a Champ, which is like the great starting thing because it's so simple and it's so rewarding because it sounds so damn good. And I still use that today. And then from there, I just kind of, me, anytime I get into something a little bit, there is no little bit. It's always way down, deep dive into it. So I built like maybe 4 or 5 more after that, like a deluxe Marshall 18 watt, like a Kalamazoo Model 1, which is basically a Champ, but with an EL84, and a couple other things, I think. And then I kind of got out of it. No, I know what happened. After I built a number of amps, I learned that I didn't really like building amps as much as I liked collecting and taking care of and restoring old amps.
Yeah.
So I like kind of gave up building and just focused on a few kind of basket cases and brought them back and did some things for friends on their amps, got them up and running. So that's how I got into it. And then I just totally, here I have a small stockpile of amps. I hadn't thought about it for months, and I just played them for months and years. And then just given the pandemic and the tube shortage that we went through, kind of stirred that up again. So now I'm back to, dicking around with amps. Hope that answered your question.
It did, man. Because I've always been curious about that. But that's a good segue into so the podcast that Chris turned me on to is The Truth About Vintage Amps with Skip Simmons. And he is, for those of you who don't know, he is the amp guy in Northern California, and he's worked on everybody's amp, who's anybody, tube amp, that is, vintage tube amp. And Chris turned me on to this, and I totally dig it. The main reason I love this guy is because his philosophy is very in line with Chris's and my philosophy about gear in general, which is leave it alone as much as you can, or, without messing up the vintage nature of it. But like you were saying, you're a caretaker of this stuff. And Skip Simmons considers himself basically just a maintenance man or a repair man, right? Right. All of the old TV repair people, where you come in and you just, it used to work fine when it was brand new. His job is to get it to just work the way it did when it was brand new, the caveat is he, based on what the needs of the customer are, he will, he'll do what, needs to be done. But basically his rule of thumb is, hey, and also his rule of thumb is, when somebody has a quote problem, he says, well, the first thing I do is I service the amp. I clean it. I make sure the tube sockets are clean, everything. And then from there, if something's still wrong, then he'll go in to figure it out. But I just love his philosophy about amp repair,
Totally. To keep it as original as possible for as long as possible is kind of a noble thing to do. I mean, nobody wants to try to drag a tweed amp with leaky caps out to a show, So definitely he's into addressing that. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that get replaced in amps as part of a tech service that doesn't need to be replaced. Yep. You know what I mean? I'm pro changing anything that's obviously bad. There's no reason to have an amp with bad parts in it just to keep it original. I'm not into that. Having the knowledge to be able to test that and know and think responsibly about what to do in that situation is what I'm for.
Yeah, and me too. And I just love that whole ethos of exactly like you were saying. It's like, because like you said, there are some people where their rule of thumb is, no, when you get a vintage amp, you just automatically replace these parts. And it's like, no. You like you said, test everything out and see which parts are bad, which parts still have longevity to them, and leave as much as you can intact, because I just think there's something, and I do love players who take their gear out and play it too, the vintage gear.
Oh yeah.
I think that's absolutely so cool, man. And granted it's a crapshoot because all kinds of shit can happen. Somebody can steal it, or it can get damaged, or any number of things. But right. This stuff is made to be played, and so I love it when people, large acts or some just working musician has cool vintage gear that they take out and they play, and record with and everything else. I think it's cool.
Yeah, that's what it's for.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's so much. The other thing too, when I got back into this, I had forgotten a bunch of shit. So I'm like trying to remember all the nerdy details that I collected back in the early 2000s. And there's just a ton of misinformation out there, and just like a bunch of like schools of thought that I don't agree with after, finding, looking into things for myself and testing things and thinking about things. It's like, no, I don't agree with that. And, knowing how to do that, I was thinking that it's much harder to find an amp tech that you can trust than like a guitar tech, because everything's right there. If he messes up your guitar, it's there. All the stuff inside, what did they do in there? And even some techs who seem to be pretty savvy, you got to make sure you're down with what they're doing.
Yeah. That's what I like about podcast like Skip's too is granted, some of these areas can be gray, and he even says, there's room for disagreement, which is totally cool. But by and large, he's got so much experience. He's worked on so many amps. He's got all this knowledge that's another service that he provides, is just trying to clear the air on a lot of this misinformation or misconceptions people have about things.
There's a lot of horror stories out there from tech experience. Even just like recently, I'm helping my friend sell a bunch of gear, like guitars and amps. And he has a really cool drip edge Bassman. Oh, and I said, cool, we'll take some pictures. Is it all original? He goes, no, we just had a cap job and they replaced the power transformer. And I'm like, okay. It was in Nashville, a tech in Nashville. And so when I was writing to get more information, I'm like, so you still have the old transformer and the caps, right? And he said, no, he didn't get them. And I'm like, so now that makes me wonder what else is going on inside. Right. You did a cap job. So I guess we'll have to look in there and see. That's the thing. It's like a power transformer being bad is pretty rare. It's pretty rare. I'm not saying that the dude didn't find a bad transformer, but if you find a bad transformer in an amplifier, it's part of the amp. You know what I mean? It has the same numbers on it, the serial numbers and all that stuff that should be with the amp. So that is a tech red flag right there.
Yep.
Well, hopefully, because it's a really cool amp. So hopefully it's all good. And I don't think a power transformer in a Bassman like that, given that there are so many great, options for transformers now, would be like a kiss of death, but it's definitely going to ding that a little bit. And
totally.
And if he just replaced the big filter caps, is going to be better than if he replaced all the caps. Because cap job to some people means, something else entirely.
Well, like you're saying, I mean, I think, one of the rules of thumb of good techs is if I replace parts in your vintage amp, you'll get all the original parts that I took out. I'm not going to throw them away because you want to retain those so that you can it can still be kind of part of the whole package, and somebody buying it can go, oh, okay, cool. But like you said too, exactly. I mean, that would make me wonder if they replace the transformer. Yeah.
If the transformer is still good. I mean, Skip was talking on one of those podcast episodes about someone coming to him with an amp that they had a bad power transformer. And he said, bring the transformer. And the dude brought the transformer and the transformer was fine.
Yeah.
So, who knows? But now I guess we'll never know because that transformer is no longer there. Nobody should put bad parts in an amp, but you should think about the originality of an amp.
Yep.
You should look at it like, if I could take this bag of parts and put them back in this amp is original. Yeah. That means that bag of parts has value for that amp. Even the cord, I mean, an old 2-prong cord, if it's original, stick it in the bag and let the new owner have it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's all good stuff too. It's like, because I'm the same way. It's hard for me to trust an amp tech because much more so than guitars, I think, like you said, because there's a lot less going on in a guitar, for the most part. But yeah, the amps, there's so much going on in there. And like you said too, I remember I've had amp service, and a lot of times it's like after I get it back, I'm like, what did they do? And so, yeah, I think it really behooves all of us to do a bunch of research and get referral, if a friend of ours has a good tech, make sure you trust somebody that's going to work on your amp. And then also, like you were saying, like make sure their protocol kind of meets your requirements, like you and I, like my protocol is, hey, I expect a bag of parts. Cause I know that even my guitar, like I remember I've gotten bags of parts when somebody's like, I had a bad pot or something in a guitar and, sure enough, they put the old pot in and gave it back to me. So yeah, I think that's important just as a trust factor too. Like, hey, this is what I took out of your amp. Here it is,
Right. So, especially with a vintage amp, you have a little bit of added responsibility when it's something vintage because there's only so many of them.
Yeah. But also, like you were talking about tubes, like I never paid that much attention to my tubes until something went wrong. And so I had an issue recently where one of the tubes was going bad in my Vox, and sure enough, I started, changing them out, and it was the first tube that was bad. So I replaced it. Now I have a spare set of tubes, which I never had before. So that's another thing I would recommend, players at least have a spare set of tubes so that if if you're suspecting something's going on at a gig or something. It's so weird though. It's insidious and gradual a lot of times that when tubes go bad. So, but sometimes it really manifests in obvious ways. Like my amp was noisy and I was getting some weird feedback. So it was like the diagnosis wasn't super hard to make, but if I had a set of tubes on me earlier, I probably would have changed them out and not had the bad amp for as long as I did and put up with it, you know.
Sorry, was it a preamp tube?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my tube issue just kind of caused me to think more about amp maintenance and keeping a spare set of tubes on me for my amps. And I checked out my Music Master bass amp and other amps too, just to make sure everything was copacetic. So yeah.
I never carry tubes with me.
No?
Well, I did the last time I went into the studio. I threw some 12AX7s in a bag. And now I dug out all my tubes. So I have like spares for everything. And I still don't bring them to shows. I mean, realistically, in a healthy amp, I mean, I haven't had to change tubes very often at all. You know what I mean? I mean, take my 64 Princeton. It's on its second set of new old stock power tubes since 1997.
That's awesome.
So, I mean, I'm getting decades out of those tubes. And there's sources that will tell you if you play your amp a lot, you know, you change your tubes once a year. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
Like change your tubes when they need to be changed.
Yeah.
I mean, and you should be able to tell. That's the key thing I think that is really important. Pay attention to your amp and kind of know it. Know when it sounds good and, know so you can listen for things. I mean, any extra noise or if it sounds a little rough, look for, check the tubes and see if they're, the power tubes, make sure they're not red plating, glowing really hot. But for the most part, I've been thrilled with how trouble-free my tube amps have been my entire playing life.
That's awesome.
I was reading when I was doing some of my research, I came across someone posting in a thread that was dealing with, biasing, which is something that is just off the hook with like misinformation and people just freaking out about. Yeah. And this poor person was like, they were talking about biasing an amp. And he said, that's why I don't play tube amps, is because he doesn't want to have to deal with biasing the amp or changing tubes and having a tech bias his amp. It's like, that really sucks that you're like just closing yourself down to the world of tube amps because you don't want to deal with something how often do you have to deal with that?
Exactly.
Since the 70s.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
very
like
seldom,
Yeah, well, sure. It's something that, and if you're that worried about it, get a cathode biased amp, you know what I mean? And just, change the tubes
exactly.
and don't worry about it. To be fair, I mean, I was stressing out about that too. I have my Princeton is a fixed bias amp, which means you have to at least check it when you change the tubes, but there's no adjustment in it. It's just a fixed resistor.
Oh, right.
So I was thinking about, well, maybe I should put a pot in there and all this stuff I was stressing out about. And then what I did was I bought a bias probe so I could at least check it. When I changed the tubes, I checked the bias and it's like, this looks good to me. So good. A lot of people assume that if you have a tube amp, you're going to just open yourself up to all kinds of maintenance and trouble and all this other shit. And it's just not true. There's amps from the 40s.
Exactly.
Still kicking.
Yeah.
We were sold.
Yeah, it's not so much bringing stuff to a gig. It's just like I never had tubes on hand at all. And like you say, I mean, the rule of thumb, you shouldn't really need to. You shouldn't really need to stockpile tubes either, because like you said, if the tubes are good and your amp is healthy, then the tubes will last a long, long time. So, and I think mine was I've had this amp for a while now, and I don't know, maybe. And it had, I think rubies in it or whatever, but, newer tubes that aren't as good as the old tubes. So,
and that's something you said. I'm speaking about old, either new old stock or just plain old tubes.
Yeah.
And those are probably more robust. Some of these tubes, we don't know how long they're going to last, like if they're going to last as long. And some of them just plain don't last that long. Yeah. I think I've had some JJ12AX7s that have gotten noisy, in like a year or more. And usually a good 12AX7 will last a long time, long time. Yeah. So that's something to be said. And which brings you to that, do I want to pay all that money for new old stock? And I'm at the point right now where I still have some old tubes that I've, stockpiled from back in the days of like scavenging stuff. And when those run out, I've already started trying new tubes. I mean, I've got some JJ 6V6s that I'm trying. And so far, I think I have one pair in my Music Master bass amp, and they're going on like 6 months or so, and
cool.
They're still going strong. So I'll give them a whirl. And, I'm open to trying stuff because I'm almost out of the old stuff, and the new old stock is super expensive. And sound wise, as far as power tubes, I really can't hear a difference. I mean,
yeah,
I've AB'd, RCAs against, whatever. And I can't really hear that much of a difference. In preamp tubes, a little bit, like, because there's a gain factor, especially if it's in the first position. So, but it's not that apparent. I mean, to hear people talk about, tube rolling, have you heard that? Like where you just take a bunch of like preamp tubes and you like put them in one at a time and see which ones sound the best.
Oh.
And to hear people describe that process, it's just something I haven't experienced, where it's like I put this tube in and suddenly the mid-range became ultra transparent, and it had just like, it's like a tone control or something. And
oh, got it.
I certainly haven't experienced that. So it's funny. I mean, with a tube amp is like anything else. If it's a foot pedal or whatever, they'll find one component in the whole amp that they apply the mojo to. And that's where the mojo comes from.
Right.
And it's like, with a tube amp, it's never been more apparent that it's the sum of the parts that make the amp sound what it does. I mean, you can take a pair of chopsticks inside like a Tweed Champ and move the wires around and it'll sound different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's all the little bits, which is why when you're dealing with an original amp, it's like keeping as many of those bits in there, helps retain the original sound of the amp. So
Amen. Yeah. I mean, that's what I guess that's, to wrap up, that's the advice I would give anybody is like you're saying, just know your amps, play them, kind of know how they sound, and also kind of, know when they don't sound right or something's going on, and so that you can diagnose it. And like we were saying before too, like maybe the first step is just maintenance, or, service the amp, make sure everything's clean, make sure everything's, the way it should be before you start to think, oh, was there something major wrong with my amp?
Yeah. A lot of times it's the like cleanliness of things, like the pots and the tube sockets are some of the most important things. There's many times where I was convinced, oh, the tubes are bad, because it would be like, I just cleaned the tube sockets not too long ago. But sure enough, it's like a tube socket. Once they get old, they get prone to, like build up. But if you're telling people to get into that, to do that themselves, they should definitely, you want to check out like tube amp safety first. People are terrified of tube amplifiers, and I was before I started too, because everything out there just suggests that as soon as you open a tube amp up, there's like 300 volts of electricity is going to find you. Yeah. But the thing of it is with a good meter and just a little bit of know-how, you can check for voltage and get rid of it. It's in there. So the dangerous thing, anybody that wasn't actually inside an amp working, the one thing to keep in mind is retensioning tube sockets, which is something that needs to be done once they've been a lot of tube changes and the tube sockets are getting old. Is like the little pins that hold, or the little cups that hold the pins of the tubes will get loose from just, over time, and you have to kind of go in there with a tool and retension them. And that's something that you definitely want to make sure you know how to get rid of the voltage in your amp before you try that, because that'll zap you.
Yeah, that's a good point too, is just safety and being mindful of what you should do before you go in and start poking around. Yeah, that's a good call.
To illustrate my 1964 Princeton, which I've played a lot, I've never had to retension the tube sockets in that. I got it in 97, so I don't know if it had been done before that, but it's still, I've never had, the only thing that I've done to that since I've had it, changed the power tubes once. I don't think I ever changed the preamp tubes in that since I've had it. And I've cleaned the sockets maybe 4 times, probably since 2008, since I took interest in amps. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 times I've cleaned the tube sockets, and it's running great. I grabbed that before one of my last shows where I was doing a small strip down thing where I didn't need a lot of power, and it was great. I mean, I love that amp. It gets played all the time. That's going to need something someday. I mean, it's so original. So my plan is just to keep an eye on it. You know what I mean? And yearly maintenance, and check it out. Pop it open every once in a while. Check the voltages. Listen for anything. If it starts getting noisy or something, I have some things I can look at. But I'm going to keep that as original as I can.
And like you were saying, I mean, when you really think about it and you really look back, like tube amps aren't that big a maintenance hassle at all. I mean, really. And so, yeah, I mean, I just like you're saying, just keep your eye on it and do service it and clean it and make sure it's okay. But by and large, that, if you've got a tube amp, it'll last a long, long, long time, and with most of the original parts. So yeah, that's cool. So we recommend that podcast to anybody that's interested in amps. We'll put links on our site and everything too. It's The Truth About Vintage Amps with Skip Simmons. And then also we didn't really touch on, but there's a YouTube channel for Fazio Electric, and it's Colleen Fazio, and she's a great amp tech. And she basically does work on amps, and you can be a fly on the wall and watch her, do repairs and fix these amps. And it's really cool. So
that's great. Yeah, you get to look over her shoulder when she does a lot of cool restoration stuff.
Yep.
There's also another one I'll shout out is Uncle Doug. He's got great, like very informative videos. He's kind of kooky, but lots of great, like look over the shoulder into some really cool amps. And just, that's a really informative one.
Love it. Love it. Well, thanks for listening as always, Chris, and I appreciate it. And we'll keep doing it. And you got any parting thoughts, Chris?
No, just rock and roll, okay?
Until next time. Later.
Bye.